Okay, good afternoon. My name is Julia Copley, Head of Operations at the MGAA, and on behalf of the MGAA, I'd like to today welcome you to our webinar, which is being hosted by Terra Firma. Before I introduce our presenter, I would like to run through a few housekeeping points. Please ensure your microphone and your camera is off. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the chat button at the bottom of your screen, and these questions will be answered during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. This presentation is accredited for CPD points if it's relevant to your ongoing professional development, and the video will be available on our website and YouTube channel post-event. We will also be providing a copy of the slide deck post-event where our presenters' contact details can be found. Please take time to respond to our feedback survey post-event. It's really important that you do this so that we can provide the best quality events to our membership. So today's webinar, Ground Risks, is presented to you by Terra Firma, and I'd like to introduce Dr. Tim Farewell, Director of Science and Communications. Tim is one of the UK's leading academics on ground hazards, specialising in the dynamic interactions between geohazards and infrastructure. He's devoted almost 2 decades of his academic career to modelling the environmental impacts on property and land, and works closely with research data, including climate change modelling to map changes in ground conditions now and in the future. Previously of Cranfield University, Tim joined Terra Firma as Director of Science and Communications to help property professionals and financial organisations understand complex geospatial environmental data to enhance their decision making. So Tim, if I might hand over to you.
Thank you, Julia. Okay, wonderful, lovely to be with you today. Thank you for having me. And what I'm hoping today is that you leave with a, either a more detailed or a completely new view of the soil and the ground that's underneath the properties that you insure. So we're going to be looking at climate change and how it will impact on the ground and how that ground will impact on the built environment today. So I will consider today a real success if at the end of this you go away and you're able to describe to other people at your work the risk from 4 major types of ground hazards that we have issues with in the UK, how they are now and how they're going to change into the future. Julie's asked me to pull together a couple learning outcomes. So I'm right back at the university here. What I'd love you to do is be able to list the 4 main ground hazard types affecting UK properties, look at the, and be able to describe to others the kind of processes that lead to a house suffering damage from these hazards. And at some point, I would like you to engage personally with this for your own business and think about the importance of each of these hazards and how they relate to your book, to the things that you insure. And finally, be able to describe the changing risk levels and the distribution of these hazards as our climate shifts from, as it is kind of now and has been for the last few decades, to a climate which is warmer and wetter in the winter and hotter and drier in the summers. So those are the kind of the structure of today and what I'd love you to get out of it. As a way of introduction for me, I'm a long-time academic. I stepped out of a pure academic role about 1.5 years ago, and really what I love to do is help people like you understand climate change, understand ground hazards and how they impact on your books, so that you can make better decisions. I don't like black box thinking. I like people to understand what's actually going on so they can make better decisions. Now, I, in this role, work for Terra Firma, and we are a science-driven company. This is just a subset of my excellent colleagues. And we've got engineers, mining engineers, civil engineers, climate scientists, geoscientists, geologists, soil scientists. And what we all love to do is take people from kind of confused to a state of clarity about the ground and how it impacts on the built environment. And we do help a lot of people. Over the last 6 or 7 years, Terra Firma has grown from a very small company to helping thousands of people every week understand the ground through our conveyancing reports, which we sell through solicitors. But and that's really great because it helps people, look at the risks which actually impact on a property. And now what we're doing is taking that information and that expert knowledge and really helping at a larger scale insurers, lenders, government understand these types of risks at a much broader scale. And we put that under the bucket of the National Ground Risk Model, which is the model which looks at all of these kind of hazards together. But if you just take one thing away from today, even if you have to leave now, just remember that when it comes to climate change, when it comes to ground hazards in the financial sector, what happened 20 years ago isn't a great indicator of what's happening today in terms of those hazards. And it's certainly not a good indicator of what's going to be happening in the coming 20 years. We're going to see, frequency changes of these, extreme weather events. New areas are going to be at risk from particular ground hazards. There are obviously, we're already seeing changes in the regulation in that environment from the Bank of England and so on. And also there are changes in terms of opportunities and commercial advantages on the way that as a business you adjust to these changing hazards, these changing regulations. So the past is not equal to the present, and it's certainly not equal to the future. But before we really dive in, what I'd love to know now is, of the 4 hazards that we're going to consider, which do you think is the most threatening to your business? So we're going to look at 4 hazards today. And Julia, if you can put up a poll, I'd love to just get a kind of finger in the air approach. Which of these hazards, we're looking at historic mining, so these holes under the ground, and houses can fall into them. Soil-related subsidence, where houses sink and crack and cause issues like that. Coastal erosion, oh my goodness, where houses fall off a cliff and end up in the sea. Or landslides. These are the 4 hazards. And I'd just love to know, from your perspective, which of these are you as a business most worried about? And we'll come back to this response in a few minutes' time. So if you can, click a button on that and let me know what you think. All right. So is our climate changing? I would be really struggling to find many scientists now who don't think the climate is changing. There is more and more evidence that what we do in terms of the way we get around, the foods we eat, the way we heat our homes, the way we throw away things, these are all contributing to fundamental changes in the atmosphere. And just this is a very simple, perhaps too simple, illustration of what's going on. But we've got lots of energy coming into the Earth from the sun, and some of that heat escapes as infrared light into space. But what happens as certain gases accumulate in the atmosphere? More of that energy is kept within the Earth's atmosphere, and it just leads to this gradual heating of the Earth. And we can see this. I presume a number of you will have seen visualizations like this before, where we rank years in terms of coldest to hottest, blue to red. And you can see a pretty clear trajectory there that the hottest years are occurring in most recent times. This is a trend which has been going on for some time. So climate change is not a future event. We're in the process of having a changing climate, but we're not at the end of it yet, and more change is coming. That was globally. So this is a global image. If we look at it in the UK, we see a very similar trend that from pre-industrial times to the present, there is a gradual increase in the average temperature. And in recent years, this rate of increase is going up. And it varies where you are in the UK. Some parts of the country are increasing at faster rates than others, but it is consistent across the whole of the country. Now, when we come to talking about climate change and climate models, you will hear terminology which you may or may not be familiar with. One of those terms is RCPs, or representative concentration pathways. And these are 4 different scenarios about the future in terms of how much greenhouse gases, the way that we live our lives, how they will translate into the warming and the changes in the weather that we are expecting. So we have 4 RCP scenarios that we look at in our NGRM climate models. The worst case scenario is RCP 8.5. So this is kind of like a high emissions scenario. And it goes down to this green line here, which is RCP 2.6, which is where we've made some really fundamental changes to the way that we are living our lives, getting our gaseous emissions under control. And they're very different scenarios. And we've built implication models for each one of these scenarios to give you a range of views into the future as to the impacts that are coming. Now, throughout this presentation, you'll probably see references to certain decades. I might refer to the 2030s or the 2050s or the 2080s. And another thing to bear in mind is that these decadal time slices are not just, this is what it will be like at 2020. That's not the way we need to consider this. With a climate model, there is uncertainty and there's overlaps between these decades. So for the 2020s, it's actually a 30-year decadal time slice, stretching from around 2010 to 2040-ish. But it does give you the pathway, the trajectory of the change. So just bear that in mind as we go forward. Okay, so if we're looking at RCP scenarios, you will often hear people talk about a 1 degree or a 2 degree or a 4 degree warming. Something to hang your hat on here. Around 2050s on this RCP 8.5 scenario, that's about a 2 degree warming, which is bad, but not as bad as a 4 degree warming, which comes in just past the 2080s on this scenario. So if you're talking about global warming of 4 degrees, which is catastrophically changed, that will be around the 2080s at the worst case scenario. Well, actually, that's just the median, which is this red line here. Okay, that's just something in terms of where we fit in terms of the global warming. What are we looking at in terms of climate change for the UK, though? Okay, rainfall is going to shift to a situation where we have very much wetter winters. So the rainfall is going to accumulate in the wintertime, and the summers will be much drier. So we're going to have these extremes in terms of rainfall pattern. Temperature, here it's getting warmer in both summer and winter. The summers are particularly problematic in terms of ground movement, and this is going to get worse, and we're going to see new parts of the countries be exposed to these warmer temperatures, leading to issues with ground hazards. The sea level rise, well, this is perhaps the most complex. And it's not just going to rise by a continuous amount around the UK. Where you are on the coast is important in terms of how much sea level rise you're expecting. But likewise, this is something which is already happening, and it's rising by about just shy of a centimeter every year. So it is an ongoing issue, and it's going to continue to become more problematic. All right. Oh yeah, what this graph is showing here are 3 areas, or for areas around the coast, how much increase in sea level we are expecting under these different scenarios. So you can see under the low emission scenario at the top, RCP 2.6, the increase is much at the lower end of 30 centimeters, 40 centimeters, and so on. Whereas under the 8.5 scenario, we're, for much of the southern part of the UK, edging towards a meter increase in sea level rise. The point I wanted to make with this slide, though, is that even if we all, encourage our governments to get under control and get emissions under control, and we encourage ourselves to stop eating meat and dairy products and all the rest, we will see sea level rise under all of these scenarios. Finally, extreme weather events. We've seen these in recent weeks as highly topical. These are unfortunately going to become more and more common. So this is just a really brief summary of the high-level climate change changes that we're expecting in the UK. So 4 things: hotter, drier summer, warmer, wetter winters, and extreme weather events becoming more common, alongside that rising sea levels. Okay, I think this is a good point to share the results of the slide and the poll. So I hope you can all see this here. We've got the vast majority, about 31 of you, thinking that soil-related subsidence is the most significant hazard that you are worried about as a business. Others are worried about sinkholes and coastal erosion, and nobody really cares about landslides. Well, at least it's not your highest risk. Okay, well, we'll see. It'll be interesting at the end of the presentation to see whether or not your views have changed on that. But that's really useful. So thank you so much for filling that in. I'm going to put that away now. All right, so some of you were concerned about sinkholes, mines, and collapses. Some of you might not know what I'm talking about, so hopefully you will very soon. Now, the UK is fascinating geologically. It's a tiny country, but it's got so much going on underneath the ground. We've got lots of different geology types, and because of that, we've got a huge number of mineral resources, which we have mined for millennia. And this can lead to problems because some of the mines were really well documented. Those in recent times, we know where they are. And then we also have other mines which might go back to Neolithic times. And we have maybe some idea where these are, but new ones do crop up occasionally as well. What's really fascinating, and I pity the poor guys who had to do this, is we've got a number of members of the team going through old mining reports and trying to locate these old mines so that you don't need to worry about it. And the references for some of these mines, might refer to the entrance being however many yards away from a public house, which no longer exists. So locating these is always a challenge, but one that we quite like doing, poring over old historic maps and the rest. But these can lead to issues where you have effectively a hole in the ground, and here's some examples of the kind of reports that we look at. What happens here, if you imagine there's a hole in the ground, and let's say 300 years ago, once they'd finished extracting the mineral from this mine, what they did is they would put some wood across the top and fill it up with soil or rocks or rubble and go, right, job done, let's move on. And that's been great for 300 years. But what's happened now is that over this time, this wood has rotted. And this is the kind of scenario that you get where this material is slowly at first washing around the edges of these cappings, or maybe it's rotted completely and it starts to trickle through. And it gets to a point where the weight of the material on top of the old mine is now so heavy that it can no longer support its own weight, and it collapses either gradually or very quickly into this hole, and that leads to these events of houses with half the house falling in, or the road, or cars, and so on. Okay, so that's effectively how these things happen. And as I said, it's not just coal mines that we're worried about, or tin mines. Even things like chalk. We've got 2 case studies here, looking at a school and some residential homes where chalk mines have caused particular problems for these people. So started off in Pinner, we're looking at a hole which appeared in a school car park, and they found mines extending beneath the school buildings. Oh my goodness, this is unacceptable risk. Why have we built a school on top of this? And so that school had to close for a number of months for that problem to be solved. And then we had some new build properties. You just bought your new house, and then, oh my goodness, this is not going to work. We need to move you out of here because there's a mine underneath it. So when we're looking at what actually links these two cases, we see this is a kind of a cross section. If we imagine we take the UK and chopped it like a piece of cake, you can see this green area is the chalk, and we've got Pinner on one side and Plumstead on the other. The same unit is on both sides of the Thames, even though it looks like they're quite far away. It's the same geological unit. And then if we look, zoom out into space, we can see the location of these mines, and again, how they relate to the edge of this green unit, which is the chalk. Okay. So mines are present across the UK. Some are more problematic than others, depending on the type of geology that they're built in. But at a glance, these are some of these hotspots that a number of our clients are particularly concerned about when it comes to residential property in particular. As we said, one of the main triggers for sinkholes is this rotting of the capping, but also it's down to the weight of the soil over top of it, and the ability of the soil to be washed away. So sandier soils are much more likely to have these washout events leading to these kind of failures. And there's a relationship between moving water, be it rainfall or a burst pipe or a leaking sewer, and the number and the size of sinkholes which do occur. So as we see extreme rainfall events increasing, we would expect to see an increase in sinkholes as well. Right. Okay, landslides. Nobody really was that concerned about landslides, which is a real bummer to my 4 science team members who have spent the last 2 weeks re-looking at our landslide model. But hopefully we'll convince you that it is of some interest to you as well. Landslides do occur in these far and remote areas. But also they do occur in urban environments. So you will be particularly familiar with Ventnor on the Isle of Wight, I'm sure, and the impact that these long-term gradual movements of these slopes and the houses built on them, the impact that they have on insurance and the impact that that has on the ability of a homeowner to sell that property. As these slides, as these news reports show, we've got occupants being told that they have to move their house, structural damage being properties, and even issues with insurance not being able to sell the house because of this. Now, there are a number of different types of landslips and landslides in the UK. This is just one, functional toy town model where effectively we've got weight on the top of the slope and pressure of water in the slope on one side kind of pushing down. Then we also have things like the strength of the soil. So different soils are able to hold more or less weight than others. And what's going on at the bottom of the slope. We need to look at a number of these kind of factors when we're looking at the risk of a particular slope and how likely it is to fail. Water, as that increases, it acts kind of like a lubricant in the slope. It also increases the weight. So again, we have this relationship between increased rainfall, increased water in the soil, in the ground, leading to these large failures of slopes. There's a number of different types of landslips, and we can classify them as we go around the country. Different parts of the country are more or less susceptible to each of these landslide types. As we've said, there is this relationship with rainfall. So when we have higher peaks of rainfall, you will see that there is an associated increase in the number of landslides which are associated with that. And this is some work we're working on in more detail now and looking at those threshold levels. So how much rainfall, how many millimeters of rainfall do you need within a certain number of weeks in order to increase this? Because you can see there is a relationship, but it's certainly not perfect. So what's going on and how do we quantify this in even more detail? It's really an interesting bit of work. So this is what we're estimating, is that as we lead to, into the future, when you have increased rainfall in the winter months, and also extreme rainfall events where you get a lot of rain in a very short period of time, we will see more slopes failing, and so therefore more properties at risk from these type of landslides. Okay, landslides don't happen just at the inland areas, and quite a lot of the most dramatic ones you will see in a coastal region. But what I would like to do here is just flash up another poll question. Julia, if you can do that, and just get a sense of where you feel you are as a business right now in terms of the risks to your properties. So do you know which properties are at risk, or indeed the percentage of your properties at risk? And have you started to consider, how climate change is going to change that? So yeah, have an answer of that question, and it would be really interesting to see, just whether you go on a gut feel or if you've done some detailed analysis of this. Okay, let's crack on. I will flash up that answer in just a minute. Right, coastal erosion. Golly, have any of you been here? This is Burling Gap down in Sussex, which is nearish where my parents live. As you do when you're taking your kids out for the day, you look at the National Trust website, and I love this. They say, it isn't safe to sit or stand on the edge of the cliffs as they may be unstable. Yeah, they certainly are here. This is a picture that we've got from the 1900s. And we've got some beautiful lifeguard, Coast Guard properties here, with some enclosed gardens and communal buildings. As we go forward through time, so we go from the 1900s to the 1920s, and you can see already how far back this cliff edge has come towards the edge of that communal building in 20 years. Oh, that's gone by the 40s or 50s. By the 1970s, it's mostly gone, and come to current days, we've only got 3 or so of these houses actually left. And so we can look at the rate of erosion of these properties as we go through time. So you look at these cliffs and you go, they're really solid, but they're actually not. And one of my team members was saying to me yesterday, it's about 70 centimeters a year in this particular area that we're losing. So it is pretty fast. Thank goodness that doesn't apply to all of the coast. And I think last summer we were up at Dunstanburgh Castle, and that's been there for hundreds of years, and it's literally a meter or so away from the coast, still rock solid. So it's a case of understanding the geology, the wave patterns, to work out which parts of the coast are actually eroding and those which are not. So as our climate changes, we do know that we're going to see these higher sea levels. We've already said that. Under each one of these climate scenarios, we do see increased sea level change. And what I've done on this graph, which is from the UKCP 18 Marine Report, is just color in gray, this area between 1 and 2 meters sea level change. So that you can see how from London, Cardiff, and Edinburgh, and Belfast, you can see the different increases in sea level that we are expecting. How it's not consistent around the coast. Some areas are more or less susceptible than others. There is also an issue of changing wave patterns and tidal characteristics, which make, honestly, there's probably more uncertainty in terms of coastal erosion, or at least for me, than some of the other ground hazards that we'll come on to in a short period of time. But there are things that we can do in order to reduce that uncertainty, and that's what we're always trying to do. We don't promise great, perfect view as to which property will fall into the sea on the precise date, but we do want to edge you towards a better understanding of which properties are most at risk and the timescales they have left. So one of the first things we do is actually build a really good cliff edge map. because, even if you look at a historic map, a pretty recent map, you will find differences to where the coast is today. So again, we have team members who are digitizing the actual coast cliff edge, which is different to the high water line. Then we apply lots of different scenarios to look at erosion rates, and that ends up with a property level analysis. We can say almost when we would expect a house to be particularly at risk from coastal erosion. So we look at, first of all, defining where the cliff edge is first. And this is, I hope this will work, a little animation that we put together. And you can see these green areas here are where the coast was in 2003. So I'll just hit play on that. And you can see the coast moving backwards and impacting on these holiday homes and even more established properties. And what I love about this image is kind of my point that I made a second ago, is that here, this is OpenStreetMap data that we've overlaid on it. And you can still see that even though this is the most recent data, we've got roads which no longer exist being mapped there. So the coast is always changing. New properties are coming at risk all the time, and that will continue as we go forward. So one of the things that we're really excited about is being able to earmark each property and say, this is our best guess when it's going to fall in the sea, but also provide buffer zones as, these are high risk zones, because sometimes the coast, it's not a continual, we lose, X centimeters a year. Sometimes we do have these massive slope failures like we saw at Scarborough, where it all slipped down. So we want to mark the properties which are particularly at risk of loss of value in a particular decadal time slice. All right. So what this means is that we can go from present day and just flag up those properties which are particularly problematic as we go forward through time. So how does this impact in terms of numbers of properties at risk? We're going from something, around 10-ish thousand properties at risk at the moment. Significantly more will become at risk as we proceed through time, up to around 35,000 under RCP 8.5. And this is due to, obviously the coast is eroding, but there are more properties built at some distance in from the coast which will become at risk. So that will change as well. When we're looking at which parts of the coast are most problematic, well, we've got a number of sites which we've flagged as having extreme erosion issues. But I just wanted to come back to this point that sea level rise will be everywhere. So it's not just erosion, it is also sea level rise that we need to look at, and where the water will go and the impact of that on property. Okay, what I'm going to do is at this point share the slide, the poll, if that's all right. Let's see if I can share these results. Okay. So the question was, do you know which percentage of your properties are at risk from ground hazards? And wow, the vast majority of you probably don't. Okay, that's really interesting. I'm always happy to chat with you individually if that's of interest to you, in order to help you. But hopefully you're learning something of this from today. But it is really good to look at your portfolios and see which are at risk. And that's something we can always help you with if that's of interest. Let me stop sharing that. Stop sharing. How do I put this away? I'll put that over there. Okay. So we've saved the best for last. Like most of you said, soil-related subsidence was the risk that you're concerned about. It's music to my ears because I spent about 2 decades as a soil scientist at Cranfield, and then obviously Terra Firma now, looking at soil-related subsidence. Most people find soil completely dull and uninteresting, and frankly, I did as well when I started. But the more I looked into it, I was like, oh wow, there's a lot going on, and this stuff that makes your hands dirty when you're planting your veg. Wow, it does actually control a lot what's going on in the ground and on top of it. So I've come to appreciate soil. And I want to give you a couple questions that I'd just love you to bear in mind when you're going through thinking about clay-related shrinkage, which is the dominant form of subsidence in the UK. The first question is, can the soil shrink as it dries? And to do this, I'm going to pull up a little experiment that we did here with my kids and with their Lego. And this is a time lapse. I've got my my timer here. And what we've done is we've got 3 different soil types. We've got a sandy soil in the middle, and then we have a clay loam on the left-hand side and a sandy loam on the right-hand side. And so clay soils are the most expensive. Sandy's probably the least. Well, they are the least. And sandy loams are, something in the middle. This is not a pure clay, so it's not the most extreme soil, but what we're going to do, these are all dry soils. I'm going to add water to it, and we'll see the response of these soils to the addition of water. So add in the water, and you can see the sand washing out from that middle one, like we saw with those voids module. But this is fascinating. Look at this. On the left-hand side, the clay, as it absorbs the water, it expands, and you can see the brickwork separating there. So subsidence happens when this is kind of in reverse. So I'm literally just reversed the video here. And you can see that soil shrinking. The sandy loam doesn't really have any volumetric change, and this is a nonsense because you can't really suck water out and put sand back. So ignore that. But do you get the issue here? Don't build your house on pure sand. Somebody said that a couple thousand years ago. And also clay, as it loses water and as it adds water, you have this shrink, swell issue, which is a concern. Okay. Differential ground movement is really important. If you have a house that is built on 2 of these different soil types, you can imagine just how much worse that's going to be for a particular property. If you have half of it going up and half of it pretty stable, that's a problem. Now, as MGAs, you probably have a little bit more interactions with your clients, and you can ask them even more specific questions, I'm guessing, about construction type of the properties, whether or not they've had additional extensions built to their property, because this differential movement can also happen if you have a house, let's say it's a Victorian house with very shallow foundations, only 20 centimeters, 40 centimeters thick, and then you come along in the 1990s and build a 2-story extension with 3-meter deep foundations because it's a shrinkable clay soil. Then what you get is half the house completely rock solid because it's got massive foundations, and the other half of the house going up and down, which can lead to pretty normal movements between the old house and the new addition. So the second question is the weather going to be hot and dry? Because if you have hot, dry weather on shrinkable soils, that's a recipe for disaster. So we build models looking at something similar to the soil moisture deficit, so how dry the soil is as we go forward through time. Looking at it kind of now-ish, you can see the Anglian region, the southeast, those are the issues that we have with soils drying out. But as we go forward from the 2020s to the 2080s, you can see that more and more of the country is moving up into these hot and dry parts of the intermittent climates, which means that properties in the northeast in particular, which may have very shallow foundations and have not been susceptible to ground movements in the past, will become more and more at risk as we go forward through time. And this is happening now. I spent the morning with a number of water companies, and we have Yorkshire and Northumbrian already reporting issues similar to this with their pipe failures. So it's not just related to your business. This is happening across sectors, and the changes are already happening. Okay, I like to quantify models. I actually like to see whether or not our models are working, and how good they are at predicting whether or not there will be subsidence. So this is just a glance at one of our partners' subsidence claims, and we've categorized it by our subs model. So class 10 is the worst case scenario class, and here we see, it's limited in its extent, but unfortunately, you have a very much higher, almost 10 times high, well, actually more than 10 times higher rate of claims per postcode in these high risk soils compared to, the lower risk soils here. So it's a pseudo-quantitative scale, but it allows you to have a sense of the risk level for each of these properties. And we can look at how these spread as you go forward through time, and identify the increase in risk for particular regions and indeed properties under future climate scenarios. And that could be looking a couple of years out, or indeed, 40, 50 years out. If we're looking at the transition in property risk, we see that low risk properties, they're becoming fewer of these as the moderate to high risk properties increase as the climate changes. If we just look at the highest risk properties, I think this is classes 9 and 10. This is quite interesting because we see properties increasing over the coming decades, but then leveling off. And it's due to these two questions. The first, can the soil shrink? And a lot of those most shrinkable soils are in the southeast, where we're already seeing these hot and dry conditions. And once they're fully dried out, baking them a bit more isn't really going to increase the risk of that much more. So that's why we have this different shape curve than we've seen for perhaps some of the other climates, other geohazards. But we can see the spread in risk for these upper classes reaching new parts of the country into the future. And here's just another animation of the spread of classes 5 to 10 across this most southern part of the UK. So we do start with this ground dryness index, which is like our soil moisture deficit, and just see how it spreads. These hot and dry regions, even in the northeast, are becoming problematic. So we go from today in this northeast area to the 2050s, to the 2080s, it's picking out different soils and applying that future climate to it, exposing new properties to this type of ground hazards. So Julia, you gave me 40 minutes, and I hope I have stuck to time just about almost to the second. But what we were looking for was, hopefully now you have an understanding of these 4 types of ground hazards, the processes that lead to it. We've had a discussion about the importance for your business of these hazards and the changing risk levels for these different hazards. So I hope that that's what you've taken away from today. And yeah, if you'd like to ask any questions, I would be delighted to answer any of them for you as well.
Thank you, Tim. That was fascinating. And even if you're not an underwriter and concerned with the risks that you covered off here in this presentation, I just think it's fascinating and incredibly frightening how quickly some of these changes are occurring. And they're not just, you can't even say that they happen during the course of history. These are on many occasions during our lifetime. So yeah, it's fascinating but incredibly concerning. We actually don't have any questions at the moment. Oh, actually, I have got a question. I'm lying. Does Tim have any headline figures on the average annual loss to insurers from ground hazards now and into the future?
That's a great question. It depends on the type of year. So if we look at 2018, that was a really expensive year, wasn't it? I think there we were losing 60, 70 million just down to ground related issues. And then you have other years where it's very much less than that. So the ABI does try and keep a good record of the level of claims, both the number and the costs attributed to that, but there is a lag on that, and so they will have the most up-to-date figures for that. But yeah, it varies year on year. What's really interesting is not to be all doom and gloom about this, because there are new technologies that are coming in which allow us to remediate at perhaps in less expensive ways than we used to. So no longer do you have to completely underpin a whole house. There's, for particular soils, you can inject resin into the ground, which may or may not be a more cost-effective way. So there's not a direct relationship over decadal period between number of claims and the actual cost that's applied. The other thing I would just say on that is, as well as the technique, also if you get lawyers involved for maybe removing a tree or issues like that, costs can spiral there as well.
Thanks, Tim. Another question for you. I would just actually add to that. You mentioned ABI figures there, which I would imagine only be available to ABI members, but it might be for that particular person who asked the question. It may be that their capacity provider, if they're members of the ABI, might be able to provide you with some of the figures there that you're requesting.
And also, this goes to everyone. If you have any questions like that, my email is tim.farewell@terraformasearch.co.uk. Feel free to email me afterwards. I've got some papers which I wrote with a student a year or so ago where the ABI did provide us those figures, so I can make that available to you. Or if you want more details like that, just drop me a line. We can pick those up as well.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, your details are in the slide deck that we'll issue post-event, so thank you for that. So I've got another question. How do large financial institutions like banks consider ground risks?
Sorry, say it again. How do
large financial institutions like banks consider ground risks?
They're only just getting around. So I've been working with insurers for decades in this space. Banks they've been a little bit slower off the marks. We've been working with a couple for a couple years, but there's a number of different ways. So some of the banks that we work with we will do a portfolio assessment for them, where we literally take their book and run it through our model and then return to them a score for each of those properties. Or provide a very summarized view in terms of which properties are at risk now and how that will change into the future. So yeah, some then will build it into their lending models in terms of the decisioning. So they might be very risk averse and want to block off certain risks from, they want to reduce the risk of lending. So there's a number of different ways. Some just want to get a handle on what the risks are now, and others want to use it a bit more proactively in terms of reducing risk on their lending. Does that make sense?
I think we do. Yeah, I think we do forget sometimes that banks are also underwriting the risk of lending as well.
Well, particularly for the when you have a catastrophic loss, your gut feeling may be that the insurer pays for some of this, but there is residual liability for the banks, and they are really waking up to it. And we've seen in the last year a 5-fold increase in the number of banks who want to look at this. So.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Tim. I've got another question for you. Do you believe there is sufficient support from the Government Environment Agency to support the efforts to mitigate the effects of coastal erosion? Have these been modelled?
Golly, I could get myself into political hot water with this one. It really depends on your philosophy, doesn't it? Because we're involved in a really interesting project with the Coastal Partnership East at the moment, where we're looking at these kind of issues. What is cost effective? What are the impacts of losing properties, of losing infrastructure, roads, and so on the ability of a community to provide economic services? So is there enough resources? Obviously not, if you want to keep the coastline as it is today. But is that what, do we always want to be fighting a losing battle where we've built in highly eroding coastline? Is it actually a decision that we make as a community that we go, this is, there are environmental benefits which outweigh the economic loss from these properties? So yeah, it's a really hard question to answer in a black and white way. There's a lot of nuance that's involved there, and we do need to look at the ecology, what we can do in terms of perhaps reestablishing tidal wetlands. What will that do in terms of the green economy, which I think we've actually neglected quite a lot over the last few 40 or 50 years. Is that helpful?
Tim, I think that was very well answered. I don't in any
I haven't lost my job or
or
been fired.
Well, let us know and we'll see what we can do with our membership. Okay, we've got another 10 minutes. If there are any more questions, please feel free to submit these into the chat. What do you feel? I know that, again, we might be venturing into political hot water again, but what do you think in terms of our industry, and perhaps with MGAs more importantly in mind, what do you think that we can do as a sector? What would be the priority? What would be your number one piece of advice to our MGA members?
Okay, if I were an MGA, if I were lending my money on these properties, I would certainly want to understand the risk better. So the first step you guys have already taken, understand these type of hazards and how they could impact on my book. So that would be the first step. I would then look at it in a lot more detail and identify which properties are at risk now, because if you have an accumulation of risk of a particular type, you've seen this blatantly with flooding in the past, but it does apply to a lesser extent with particular ground hazards as well. So if you're insuring high value properties, which are particularly susceptible to particular ground movements, and we are shifting our climate towards one with these hotter, drier summers, as anybody who was in underwriting or insuring in some way or have some financial relationship with a property, I would want to know which properties are at risk, so that I may want to know that. I might be happy to continue to support those properties, but at least I'm doing it with my eyes open to the risks and the potential costs that are associated with that. The other thing, if I can ramble for a second, is the advantage that I've seen, and this is particularly with more commercial, away from the resi business, commercial or people like MGAs who have a bit more time to look at these risks. I was at a presentation for a very large commercial underwriter, and this is a public forum, which is why I can repeat it. And they said, looking at these risks at a property level was the best and easiest sell they ever had to make to their board in terms of investment, because it allowed them to understand which properties were at risk. And so let's say they're writing in a high risk area. All their competitors were assessing risk at maybe postcode level. And they could say, well, we know that there are pockets within this postcode which are higher or lower risk. And so they could charge a slightly lower premium than their competitors to win the business, but know that the properties they were insuring were actually really quite low risk. So, keep a small additional amount of money each time. So it's things like that. And this comes back to, how do you adjust your business to make these little incremental nudge decisions, which make you more profitable and kind of buffer you from these risks and the impact to you.
I think perhaps our members might question the fact that they have more time. However, I think you're also right. I think many of them would agree that certainly they have, if you call it the luxury of being able to scrutinise their book of business slightly more than the bigger insurers and the insurers certainly that work on volume. And actually, in support of what you've just said, your top tip is to understand. The next question is, which of the 4 risks is the most important in 20 to 50 years? Doesn't say most important in what respect, but I take it as perhaps the most important to consider in the next 20 to 50 years.
I'm gonna stick with subsidence, just from me, because obviously it's my passion research area, and my colleagues will slap me later, just because it is the risk where I see the biggest changes coming. I look at the Northeast and I look at these vast swathes of Victorian houses with very shallow foundations. which haven't really been exposed to these extreme weather events, these extreme drought conditions. And, for me, that is like a ticking time bomb. Obviously, landslides and coastal erosion and mines are scary as anything. They're really dramatic. And if you're looking at individual loss, you'll lose a lot more from those kind of failures, those kind of events. But in aggregate, if you're underwriting, insuring, have a financial relationship with large number of properties, subsidence, I think, is the one that is going to cause the most damage and the most loss over the next 40 or 50 years.
Great advice for our underwriters, but not so good for homeowners, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, and which cycles back to the way that we, where our business really started, was helping to educate homeowners and about these changing risks. It's not good enough anymore just to know what the risks are now. But if, like me, you have a 30-year mortgage, if at the end of the 30-year mortgage you have to go, oh my goodness, there's these massive cracks in my house, I'd rather know that before I invest in a property.
Tim, I've got another question. Great question. Are modern building regulations keeping pace with the anticipated increase in subsidence due to climate change, especially in the SE area? Is this something that national builders are keeping pace with?
So I am tangentially and hopefully less than that, more than that, involved in a number of groups who are working in this space, looking at the impact of trees in urban design in London, and also in liaison with NHBC in terms of sorting out the governance, the guidance that's going towards that, because they're not up to the speed, and there's a lot more that we can do. If I can rant, slightly as a this is my own personal opinion rather than that of my company, but if I look at the way that we're still recommending that we do foundations, I find it infuriating that we are still recommending people pump concrete into the ground, because if you look at the emissions that come from the foundation design, it accounts for between 40 and 60% of the entire CO2 emissions for the property, and that's just below the ground. So what I would love to see, if it were up to me, is that as an industry we shift away from pumping concrete into the ground and come up with slightly more cost-effective foundation designs where they're appropriate, like pile and beam, which have vastly lower carbon emissions associated with it. You can go deeper, but they're incrementally more expensive. So they might be 10 to 12% more expensive. But if as an industry we shifted it so this was the default option, I would hope that we would see cost reductions in that, and they actually become cheaper as they become easier to install. So that's my slight rant. Apologies for that. But it is important, because the flip side of that is trees are, and this is something I haven't touched on, trees are hugely involved in subsidence, but they're really important in the urban environment. So what I would love to do is shift us to a place where we have a better relationship with green infrastructure like trees in the urban environment, because they have health benefits. Obviously, they're cooling. So some of my colleagues' research is looking at the impact of heat waves on death. And we've seen this again in the last week or so, that, but this will come to the UK, and we're going to, relatively soon in the future, see transition from more people dying of cold to more people dying of heat in the next decade or so as these heat waves become more important. And trees can lower the temperature by, about 10 degrees at the top of the canopy. So they're massively important, but we do need to build in a sensitive way that allows trees to be in close proximity to houses.
Thanks, Tim. We've run out of time. Thank you so much. That was a really fascinating presentation. A great set of questions submitted and great answers, so we appreciate that. To our delegates, thank you so much for dialing in. We appreciate that. As I said at the top of the meeting, please complete the Survey Monkey that you'll be sent for feedback. This only takes 3 minutes of your time maximum, and it really does help us determine which are the events that we should put on more frequently for our members. So thanks again, Tim, terra firma, and thanks to our delegates. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you all very much.